All right, so we are going to start looking at the cerebrum. In the last set of slides, we kind of went over the general structures of things, so now we're going to get a little more specific. This is where we left off last time, talking about the cerebrum and these parts to it. The cerebral cortex in this gray layer that is on the outermost part. Just for a little FYI, you're going to see this word a lot more as you go through. Cortex. Cortex has another counterpart called medulla. Cortex means outer, medulla means inner. So for instance, and when you get into the 211 and you look at the kidney, the kidneys are called renals, and so you've got a renal cortex and a renal medulla. The renal cortex is the outer layer, renal medulla is the inner layer. So the cerebral cortex is an outer layer of gray matter, and we said that gray matter is mainly cell bodies. While it is an easy way to think of it as unmyelinated axons, it's a lot more than that. Anywhere you see gray matter in the central nervous system, there is a thought process going on. There's decisions that are being made. This is where an area of all the synapses are, as opposed to white matter, which is basically bundles of myelinated axons. It is the communication cables, but it makes up most of the cerebrum because it is, again, just connections back and forth. Remember also that this cerebral cortex is where the majority of the cell bodies are in the nervous system. And those cell bodies, while we're going to have one axon, these are going to be those multipolar neurons that we looked at in the last chapter. And understand, each of these can have up to 10,000 plus synapses on the cell body and maybe on the dendrites here or there, because this is where the communication is. Now, in this next slide, I took a picture just to kind of show you what the cerebral cortex really is. So this is a picture we're going to look at towards the end of this video for the basal nuclei. Don't worry about that because we're not there just yet. But what I wanted to point out is this gray layer right here. That is the cerebral cortex. You don't have to worry about all these things that it's pointing out. But that is the cerebral cortex. So 75% of all the neurons in your body are going to be found all along this thin gray layer. And so that's a really important layer of cells for information. We're going to look at this basal nuclei again a little more in depth as we go on, but this is little pockets of gray matter in here. And like I said, anytime you see gray matter, there's decision making going on and kind of synapses and organization. This is another one called the thymus. We're going to see how these as one group have kind of an opposite but similar thing, job as the thymus. So the basal nuclei and the thymus are kind of like two sides to a coin. Now, the cerebral cortex is responsible for the higher mental functions. This is just saying that this is where you're going to store your memories. There's going to be impulses that are coming in from sensory organs. They're coming into the central nervous system. Right? This is where I'm going to go through whatever's coming in. I'm going to go through my memory bank. I'm going to decide, have I felt this before? And if I have, I'm going to go through, and all the information about that I'm going to be able to sort through without you even knowing it. It's going to say, did I like what I did in response to this sense? Did I not like it? Do I want to try something else, or do I want to do the same thing? That's kind of what we call reasoning. And then once I make a decision, it's going to instigate voluntary movements to make it happen, right? This is where intelligence and personality is located. So this is a really important area. So as we look at some of these functional portions, we're going to see that it can be divided up into three things. Sensory, which is incoming, association, which is kind of weird, and then motor. We're going to talk about association in a minute. So we've got incoming information. It's going to go in and it's going to start being associated with other memories, senses, and previous actions. And then a motor impulse, if needed, is going to be initiated. So these two, sensory and motor, are pretty easy to kind of just kind of group. There is a central sulcus right here. This little area right here, it is a sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is just simply the little valley between the ridges, which we call gyra. But there is a central sulcus that is in everybody's brain that runs right through the middle. And what's going to happen is the frontal lobe, which is the only thing anterior to it, that is motor. And then, and I'm definitely not going to try and write sensory, everything posterior to the central sulcus is sensory. And that includes the temporal lobe. So I could draw a little line basically like this. And everything is divided up. Sensory on one side, motor on the other. And the motor is basically the frontal lobe. Now the association areas are going to kind of overlap back and forth and kind of all around. Yeah, that's like a little child scribble. But the association areas are going to be very interconnected, so to speak. So these are the sensory areas. Now, first off, the sense of smell, again, I'm not going to get into certain ones, and we're not going to worry about where the sense of smell is located. It's in the temporal lobes. The sense of taste, you should know that is, it's going to be what you taste. You don't have to know it's in the insula. All right. I do want you to know the auditory area. Your sense of hearing is in the temporal lobe. The visual area is in the occipital lobe. I do want you to know that. So you've got your eyes way up here in the front, right? And those optic nerves are going to go all the way back, and they get analyzed way in the back in this visual area. So I want you to know visuals in the occipital, auditories in the temporal. Now this one is the main one I want you to know here. This is the one that isn't intuitive. This isn't just easy to figure out. The other ones are relatively are, but this one I do want you to know. Sensory speech area. This is called the Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area is the area where when I hear something, all right, it comes in, I'm going to have a part of my brain, which is called the Wernicke's area, that is going to hear it. Let's see if I can. It's going to hear it, and then it's going to analyze it and decide. And again, remember our little dividing line here, so we're on the sensory side. Wernicke's area is here. You don't have to know. It's kind of right in between. It's got a little bit in the parietal lobe, a little bit in the temporal lobe. But as I hear things, I'm going to have a mental image that's going to be produced, and it's going to be stored in this library. So if I said to you that I'm looking out my window and there's a pink flamingo in ballet tights running across my my yard, you should have a mental image of that. And what's happening is all of those words go in, and then I'm going to go through my little Wernicke's area of images that are tied to each word, and I'm going to have a mental image done. Now, this is also something that's going to come in when we're going to talk about how we speak. Because that little library of images, that little library that we will have with images in it, that's supposed to say image, but you know what I'm saying. I'm going to use that also when I go to talk, because I'm going to go through my images and decide what I want to say. But this is called the Wernicke's area. It is a sensory area for understanding language. Now the cutaneous area, this is something also I want you to know. The cutaneous area is sensation from the skin. We talked about this in the integumentary system. Remember, the integumentary system is made up of the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is also called the subcutaneous because the dermis and the epidermis make up a membrane called the cutaneous membrane, which by science standards is referred to as the skin. So everything that touches you is going to have a sensory input going into the cutaneous sensory area because that is the skin. This kind of breaks down. This is pretty interesting. Again, now this is going to throw it. And this side is sensory, and again, this side's motor. But you'll see how these areas are divided up. The areas, for instance, there's a lot of sensory impulses that are coming in from our hands, particularly our fingers. And so this area, and we've got it figured out and mapped out, this little area of neurons, we're going to kind of go from here to here, is going to be the neurons that are going to be getting the sensory input from my hand. And we've actually mapped it out on like chimpanzees and stuff where we've taught them how to eat with a fork. And we'll see that in certain areas in here, the neurons will increase their synapses by double sometimes, because that's learning. Learning's just about making neural connections. But that's how it's kind of divided out. And it's it's a fairly interesting study, but it's nothing that I'm going to be able to test you on. Now, the association areas are areas that do end up becoming kind of a problem because they're not cut and dry. They are basically areas that are going to associate other areas with each other. Again, so if I feel something, I'm going to have a sensory impulse. A mosquito lands on my arm. I'm going to have a sensory input coming in from that area of my cutaneous membrane, and I'm going to see that it's a mosquito. I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to see. So I've got these two things coming in, and they're going to associate vision and feeling. And then my body's going to take that incoming input. I'm going to go through all of my association areas, which are my memories, my feelings, my emotions, and I'm going to decide, has this happened before? What did I do? If it did, what did I do in response? Did I like the outcome of what I did? Do I want to change it? All of those things are in the association areas. So they're not primarily motor or sensory. They connect all structures of your brain. They're widespread throughout the cerebral cortex, and they analyze and interpret sensory information. They provide memory, reasoning, verbalization, judgment, and emotions. And so they're not a real easy thing to pin down. Now, people can study these for their entire lifetime. And, just something as simple as memory, you're going to find out memory is kind of a weird thing. Actually, you won't in this class because this book does a really simplistic job of explaining it. But you'll see that it's a very complex thing. So association areas. Now, we're going to look at the four lobes. I'm not worried about the insula. While it could be important, I'm not really worried about it. We're going to talk about the emotional part in a different area. So the frontal lobe, again, the frontal lobe, if we were looking at it sensory or motor, the frontal lobe is motor. But it is the area where we remember complex things, simple things like, and even if you might not think about it, but simple things like tying your shoelaces is a complex problem. But this is where we work out problems. It is planning, concentrating. This is where our emotional behavior is. This is where it says judging our consequences of behavior. And another way of saying it, this is where our conscience is. This is where if we're doing something and our brain's like, hey, you really probably shouldn't be doing that. That's the association area that's associated with the frontal lobe. So the big thing is probably going to be, I would say, definitely this complex problem solving and your conscience. The parietal lobe, remember this is going to be middle superior. It is understanding speech. It is going to be what we use to choose words to express thoughts or feelings. Now we're going to look at the motor area of this that's going to help form them. But this is the cross section from that Wernicke's area to where we're going to look at as Broca's. But it is where we're going to choose the words we want to say. We're going to try to figure out which words are best to express our thoughts and feelings. Look, this is the area that gets left out in texting in emails, where you can't express your thoughts as well, because there's a part of the verbalization of what you're saying that adds to the words you're saying. The temporal lobe is going to be one that's going to have a lot more. It's going to have some understanding speech in it, but the real big thing is the temporal lobe is a huge area of memories. If you like, I'm bad about. I can't remember if someone told me their name. I'd forget it before they're finished saying it, or their phone number or whatever. Listen, at churches, sometimes I have to count the people there, and I have a hard time because I have a hard time remembering certain things. I think I told you I've got a little bit of dyslexia. But the weird thing is I can hear a song and I can remember the words to it and the music patterns to it, and I'll never forget it. And it's crazy. I mean, some of us, sometimes there's things that I wish I couldn't remember. But this is where the temporal lobe is. Temporal lobe is doing. It's memories. It is movies that you've seen. It is the music that you've listened to, and how that affects your experiences. The occipital lobe is all about visual images. So I want you to make sure that anytime I talk about the occipital lobe, it is always going to be about visual images. So this is where we get into the motor areas, primary motor areas. And so again, we said that there's I draw a line right through here and then down to make sure we're good. So we're talking about things on this side. And so we've got some things we'll talk about a little later on in this area, but the big one I want to mention on this is called Broca's area. It controls the muscles needed for speech. And so this is Broca's area. This is a real common area for people to have damage during a stroke. And that's where they forget. People that have had strokes sometimes can't speak, and they have to relearn it. And what it is in their brain, they know what they want to say, but because this area is damaged, they can't control the muscles to make it happen. Frontal eye field is about eye movement. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about that. The one that I would say that I would key in on here is this Broca's area. Again, this is looking at stuff here. This is the motor side over here, and so this is the stuff that's controlling it. I've got, even the sensory right here is a big deal, and the motor is actually even a larger section to know, fine tuning how to use this. So this goes through a lot of the different stuff. Again, nothing I'm going to test you on. So this gives an idea of some of the things, the four main ones: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobes. And most of us have probably heard of things called hemisphere dominance. All right, so I do not like the way the book phrases this. It says the left hemisphere is dominant in most people, and then it goes on to talk about it and just assume that we're talking about the left hemisphere. So if I've got the brain and I'm looking straight on, I'm not going to draw all the curls and stuff, but it is divided. And so if I'm looking at it, this is the right side, this is the left side. Let me make it more clear that that's right. All right, so that's, again, because it's looking straight on. In most people, the left side is the dominant side, and most people have heard that if you are right-handed, you are left brain dominant, and if you're right-handed, if you're left-handed, you're right brain dominant. And that is not exactly true, because you can switch your handedness by just training. You don't switch your hemisphere dominance, but it is roughly the same, where close to, I want to say 80%, I forget, it's the amount of people that are left hemisphere dominant is very close to the percentage of people that are right-handed. But it is true that in our nervous system, the left side is going to control the right side of the body, and the right side is controlling the left side of the body. But that's neither here nor there. All right, so the dominant hemisphere, again, in most people, the dominant hemisphere is the left hemisphere, but it doesn't matter. The left hemisphere is what it should say here. The left hemisphere, which is usually the dominant hemisphere, is all about language skills, writing, reading, and this is analytical. The big thing to understand about this is the left hemisphere is not necessarily emotional. The left hemisphere is very much analytical. The right hemisphere, here it says the non-dominant, 'cause it's just assuming that, but the right hemisphere is what it should say. The right hemisphere, which is usually the non-dominant hemisphere, is understanding and interpreting musical and visual patterns. This is an emotional area. The right side is very artistic. This is the way it's set up. The right side is very artistic. Artists are generally more emotional. This is more engineering, and I'm just going to write a big E there for engineering. Look, here's the deal. If I had a scale of 0 to 100% or whatever I want to make, right, there is a balance point right at 50. Right, we'll just say it's 50. Most of us, we are going to have the left hemisphere as our dominant hemisphere, but only by a little bit. And actually, let me put it this way, right and left here. And so instead of, being all the way over here on the right side, or shoot, sorry, all the way over here on the left side, all right, our brain will be like 52%, and the right side's going to be about 48%. It's always very close. Most of us are right along that little borderline. And so what ends up happening is when we see someone, and we generally call them a savant. So for instance, this is a fictional person, but I grew up being a fan of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was very matter of fact. He's very non-emotional. He would be someone whose left brain, this analytical one, would be way over on this side. Right, so Einstein, a real person, let's take Einstein. Einstein's going to be way over on this side. But then we have someone like Mozart or Beethoven, who was very talented in the musical parts. They're both going to be savants, and they're going to be way over here. But again, most people are going to be really close to center. We're going to lean slightly to the left. In general, most people do, but occasionally people will lean slightly to the right. Very few people get far away from being balanced. Now, this one always kills me. Memory is such a complicated thing. We actually know the areas of our brain where memories are. Like if something damages a certain area, we know that certain memories will be lost, but we don't know how our body stores them. It is very apparent that it's very apparent that it's stored in a way that we have no idea. And so books like this, because it's hard to even talk about it without it getting very deep, it's breaking it into two types of memory. And there is so much more than this. There really is. Short-term memory and long-term memory. Guess what? Short-term memories are for short-term. Long-term memories are for long-term. Long-term memory holds more memory than short-term and lasts a lifetime. I don't know who got paid to write some of these things, but it's really kind of basic. Short-term memories, the neurons are connected in a circuit. The circuit is stimulated over and over. When the circuit quits being stimulated, the memory doesn't persist. It goes away. these are little short-term tasks. In long-term memory, as that circuit continues to be used, I use it over and over again, kind of like a path in the woods. The more I use it, the easier it is to see. And once I make this path in my brain for a memory, it can last a lifetime. All right. And this is the last slide we look at on this video. This is going to talk about a special area in the cerebellum the cerebrum that we talked about, and I used this picture at the very beginning. This is called the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei, I'm going to just kind of mention two things: nuclei and ganglion. These are both words that you probably should end up kind of knowing. All this is an area of synapses. This ganglion is not, or ganglia is not a correct term for the brain, but out in the peripheral nervous system where two neurons come to meet. So we've got this one neuron bringing information in, and it's connecting and dropping off this synapse. That's what that little area is, a synapse. This is going to end up being a swelling on the nerve itself, and there'll be thousands of synapses in here because this is going to be a big junction. That swelling is called a ganglion. Inside the nerve and the central nervous system, they're just pockets of gray matter, as it is here. They are generally called nuclei. It's still the same thing, it's just there's not going to be a swelling on it. All right, so you don't have to know the three different parts of it here, but this is some of the things I want you to know about the basal nuclei. All right, not only are they masses of gray matter deep within the hemispheres, you don't have to know the parts of it. You are going to know about dopamine. All right, this is the area where Parkinson's, this is the area of issue in Parkinson's. And so what happens is, it says here, it helps control voluntary movement. So let's say I've got a neuron here and a neuron here that are working my hand. I don't know. And I'm sending a signal out. And what's going to happen is they're going to synapse here. And since I'm going to have multiple neurons sending signals, right? So for instance, to take a single step to walk, there's close to 50 different muscles that are needed to take a single step. And so I'm going to have all kinds of neurons coming out. This area, the basal nuclei, is going to take all of this information and, using dopamine, send it out on one signal out on the spinal cord. So the basal nuclei basically funnels all of the motor information coming out. And using dopamine, it's going to cause it to have one solid signal going out. So imagine if we're sitting in class, and man, I wish we were back in class, but imagine we're all sitting in class and I'm talking and I say, all right, class, I want to know how you feel about these online tests. And everybody starts talking all at one time. I'm not going to hear anything because it's going to be overwhelming. But if I say, all right, class, this is what I want you to do. I want you to kind of pull together, you work together, figure out about 5 things that you wanted me to know. And I want you all to work together. I'm going to have one person present me these 5 things that you feel I can work on. That's kind of what the basal nuclei is doing. It's smoothing out the information. And that's why Parkinson's is known, or you can tell by the tremors, because it's not being smoothed out. The muscles are getting screamed at by, and this I've shown 4 different neurons. In the real world, there are thousands of them sending signals to every movement that you're going on. So imagine that little filter that is the basal nuclei isn't there, and it is going to have, your muscles are going to be screamed at by all kinds of different neurons. So the basal nuclei is for smoothing out motor neurons. All right, so that's a big thing to remember, and it's going to use dopamine. All right, so that's it for this video. Hope you are doing well.